How Hitler Rose to Power. The Story Nobody Tells. Chapter 1. The Boy Nobody Knew. Few people in history have left a mark on the world as devastating as Adolf Hitler. His name became synonymous with dictatorship, war, and unimaginable destruction. Under his rule, Europe descended into the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever witnessed, leaving entire cities in ruins and claiming the lives of more than 60 million people. Even decades after his death, historians continue to study one question: how did one man gain enough power to change the course of history? The answer did not begin with armies, speeches, or political rallies. It began in a small Austrian town where no one could have imagined what the future would hold. On April 20th, 1889, Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, a quiet town near the border between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official. He believed in discipline, obedience, and hard work. His mother, Clara Hitler, was the complete opposite. She was gentle, caring, and deeply devoted to her children, especially Adolf. Those who later knew the family often described two very different influences shaping the young boy. At home, strict rules came from his father, while affection and protection came from his mother. Historians still debate exactly how much this affected Hitler's personality, but many agree that these early years exposed him to both authority and emotional dependence. As a child, Adolf did not appear destined for politics or military leadership. He enjoyed drawing landscapes and buildings, spent hours sketching churches and old streets, and dreamed of becoming an artist. School, however, was another story. While he performed well in some subjects, he often clashed with teachers and resisted discipline. His father hoped he would eventually join the Austrian civil service, following the same stable career path. Adolf rejected that future completely. The relationship between father and son became increasingly tense. Arguments over Adolf's future were frequent. He insisted that he wanted to study art, while his father dismissed the idea as unrealistic. When Alois Hitler died in 1903, Adolf was only 13 years old. Although the loss changed the family's circumstances, it also removed the greatest obstacle standing between him and his artistic ambitions. For a few years, Adolf lived with his mother, whose unconditional support encouraged him to continue pursuing art. In 1907, believing he had real talent, he traveled to Vienna to apply to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. The result was devastating. His application was rejected. The Academy's examiners believed his drawings of buildings showed promise, but concluded that his paintings lacked the necessary artistic skill. They even suggested he consider architecture instead. Ironically, Adolf had never completed the educational requirements needed for such a career. He returned home disappointed, hoping to try again the following year. Before he had another chance, tragedy struck. His mother, Clara, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Adolf stayed by her side as her health deteriorated. In December 1907, she died. Many historians describe this as one of the most emotionally painful moments of his life. Friends later recalled that Hitler rarely showed deep emotion in public, but the death of his mother affected him profoundly. Now 20 years old, with no parents, no stable income, and no clear direction, Adolf returned to Vienna once again. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts a second time. Once again, he was rejected. This second failure marked the end of his dream of becoming an artist. Life in Vienna soon became extremely difficult. Without steady work, Hitler lived in cheap boarding houses and homeless shelters. To survive, he painted postcards and small watercolor scenes of famous buildings, selling them through local dealers for very little money. Some days he earned enough to eat, other days he did not. But while his financial situation worsened, something else quietly changed. Vienna, at the beginning of the 20th century, was one of Europe's largest and most diverse cities. People from across the Austro-Hungarian Empire lived there, bringing different languages, religions, and political ideas. Newspapers constantly debated nationalism, socialism, liberalism, and the future of Europe. Hitler spent long hours reading newspapers, political pamphlets, and history books in public libraries. Although he remained largely unknown and isolated, he absorbed ideas that would later influence his worldview. These years did not turn him into a political leader overnight, but they introduced him to movements and beliefs that would shape his future. Still, there was nothing inevitable about what came next. Thousands of young men struggled in Vienna. Thousands faced poverty, rejection, and uncertainty. Almost none of them would become world leaders. By 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich in Germany. He admired German culture and increasingly identified with Germany rather than Austria. Less than a year later, Europe changed forever. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, alliances pulled nation after nation into what became the First World War. Like millions of other young men across Europe, Adolf Hitler volunteered for military service. For him, the war offered something he had lacked for years: purpose. He joined the Bavarian army and was assigned as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between frontline positions under constant artillery fire. It was one of the most dangerous jobs on the battlefield. Unlike soldiers who remained inside trenches, dispatch runners repeatedly crossed open ground while shells exploded around them. Over the next 4 years, Hitler witnessed the brutal reality of industrial warfare. The trenches were filled with mud, disease, rats, and the constant threat of death. Entire units disappeared within minutes under artillery bombardments. Poison gas drifted across battlefields. Machine guns transformed attacks into massacres. Despite these horrors, Hitler gained a reputation for courage under fire. He received the Iron Cross, First Class, a decoration rarely awarded to soldiers of his rank. His commanding officers considered him reliable and disciplined. In 1918, near the end of the war, Hitler was temporarily blinded after a British gas attack involving mustard gas. While recovering in a military hospital, he received news that stunned him. Germany had surrendered. For millions of exhausted soldiers, the war's end brought relief. For Hitler, it brought disbelief. He could not accept that Germany, after years of sacrifice and suffering, had lost. Like many other Germans at the time, he embraced the false belief that the army had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies rather than defeated militarily. That myth, though historically inaccurate, became a powerful political tool in the turbulent years that followed. When he left the hospital, Germany was no longer the country he had known. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire had collapsed. Revolution spread through the streets. Inflation was rising. Political violence erupted between rival groups. The nation he believed he had fought to defend appeared broken. For Adolf Hitler, the First World War had not truly ended. In many ways, it had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Man Who Took Power. When Adolf Hitler returned to Munich after the First World War, he came back to a country that barely resembled the one he had left. Germany had been defeated. Its emperor had abdicated. Millions of soldiers were returning home, not as heroes, but to unemployment, poverty, and uncertainty. Factories were closing, food was scarce, and political extremists filled the streets. Demonstrations, violent clashes, and attempted revolutions became almost a daily occurrence. To many ordinary Germans, it felt as though their nation had completely collapsed. The Treaty of Versailles only deepened that feeling. Signed in 1919, the treaty forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war, surrender territory, reduce its military, and pay enormous reparations. Whether every German agreed with that judgment or not, many viewed the treaty as humiliating. Newspapers called it a national disgrace, and politicians who accepted its terms were often branded as traitors. For Adolf Hitler, this environment became the turning point of his life. He remained in the German army after the war, performing administrative duties, while Germany struggled to rebuild. During this period, the army assigned him an unusual task. He was asked to observe small political groups that were emerging across Munich. One meeting in particular would change everything. It was organized by a tiny organization called the German Workers' Party. Only a handful of people were present. The group had little money, almost no influence, and no clear future. But during the discussion, Hitler unexpectedly stood up and challenged another speaker. Those in the room were struck by the passion and confidence with which he argued. One of the party's founders approached him afterward and encouraged him to join. At first, Adolf Hitler was simply another member. No one believed he would soon become its dominant figure. He had no wealth, no powerful family, no political experience. What he did possess, however, was something difficult to measure. He knew how to command attention. As the party held more meetings, Hitler spoke more often. His speeches were emotional, dramatic, and carefully structured. He rarely relied on written notes. Instead, he studied the mood of the audience, gradually increasing the intensity of his voice before reaching a powerful conclusion. Supporters described him as inspiring. Opponents described him as dangerous. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. People listened. Within a remarkably short time, attendance at the party's meetings began to grow. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Recognizing the opportunity, the movement changed its name. It became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The world would remember it simply as the Nazi Party. As the party expanded, Hitler also understood something many politicians of his time underestimated. Politics was no longer fought only through ideas. It was fought through images, large banners, symbols, marches, uniforms, music, carefully organized rallies. Every public appearance was designed to leave an emotional impression. The swastika became the party's unmistakable symbol, while disciplined formations created an image of strength and order in a nation that many believed had lost both. Yet Hitler wanted more than influence. He wanted power. In November 1923, believing the government was weak and could be overthrown, Hitler and several supporters attempted what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The plan was ambitious. They hoped to seize control of the Bavarian government and then march on Berlin. Instead, the attempt collapsed within hours. Police opened fire. Several Nazis were killed. Hitler fled, but was arrested only days later. To many observers, it appeared that his political career had ended before it had truly begun. The trial, however, produced the opposite result. Rather than remaining silent, Hitler transformed the courtroom into a stage. He defended his actions for hours, presenting himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot who claimed to be acting in Germany's interests. Newspapers across the country reported his speeches. For the first time, millions of Germans heard his name. The court sentenced him to prison, but the punishment was surprisingly light. Instead of disappearing from public life, Hitler used his imprisonment to rethink his entire strategy. He reached a conclusion that would define the rest of his career. Violence alone would not bring him power. He would have to use Germany's own political system against itself. While imprisoned in Landsberg prison, Hitler dictated a book to his close associate, Rudolf Hess. The book became known as Mein Kampf. Part autobiography and part political manifesto, it laid out many of the ideas that would later shape Nazi rule. At the time, relatively few people believed it would ever become politically significant. History would prove otherwise. After his release, Hitler found the Nazi Party weakened and divided. Many leaders might have abandoned the movement. Instead, he started again. He traveled relentlessly across Germany, speaking in city after city, sometimes delivering multiple speeches in a single day. His message remained consistent. Germany, he claimed, could become strong again. It could recover from defeat. It could restore national pride. For many citizens living through economic hardship and political instability, these promises were deeply appealing. Then, in 1929, everything changed. The Great Depression spread across the world. German businesses collapsed. Banks failed. Millions lost their jobs. Families who had once lived comfortably suddenly struggled to buy food. Confidence in democratic institutions declined rapidly. The crisis created an opportunity that Hitler had been waiting for. While established political parties argued among themselves, the Nazi Party presented itself as a force of discipline, unity, and decisive leadership. Membership surged. Election results improved dramatically. Within just a few years, the Nazis had transformed from a fringe movement into one of Germany's largest political parties. By early 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg faced growing pressure to stabilize the country. After months of political negotiations, he appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many conservative politicians believed they could control him. Some reportedly dismissed him as a temporary figure who would soon lose influence. They were disastrously mistaken. Only weeks later, the Reichstag building was destroyed by fire. The incident shocked the nation. The Nazi government declared that Germany faced an immediate internal threat. Using the crisis, Hitler persuaded the president to approve emergency measures that suspended many civil liberties. Political opponents were arrested. Newspapers faced increasing restrictions. Public criticism became far more dangerous. Then came the Enabling Act. With its passage, Hitler's government gained the authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval. In practical terms, German democracy had come to an end. Over the following months, rival political parties were dissolved. Independent labor unions disappeared. Regional governments lost their autonomy. Every major institution gradually came under Nazi control. By 1934, after the death of President Hindenburg, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President into one position. He adopted a new title, Führer. Millions now pledged loyalty not to the German Constitution, but directly to Adolf Hitler himself. From the outside, Germany appeared transformed. New highways were built. Military expansion accelerated. Large public events projected confidence and national unity. Many Germans believed their country had recovered. Yet behind the spectacle, a dictatorship had taken shape. Political dissent was crushed. Fear became a tool of government, and every major decision increasingly depended on one man. For Adolf Hitler, becoming chancellor had never been the final objective. It had only been the beginning. Beyond Germany's borders, neighboring countries watched with growing concern. Factories were producing weapons. The army was expanding. Treaties were being ignored. Across Europe, few realized how little time remained before another war would begin. On September 1st, 1939, the first shots were fired, and within days, the world was at war once again. Chapter 3: The War That Changed the World. On September 1st, 1939, the silence over Europe was shattered. Before sunrise, German forces crossed the Polish border from several directions. Tanks rolled across open fields. Aircraft struck military targets and infrastructure, and coordinated attacks quickly overwhelmed much of Poland's defense. The invasion marked the beginning of a conflict that would soon involve countries across every inhabited continent. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. What many had hoped would remain a regional conflict had become the Second World War. In the first months of fighting, Germany's military achieved a series of rapid victories, using coordinated attacks by armored units, aircraft, and infantry. German forces advanced faster than many military planners believed possible. Denmark and Norway were occupied. In the spring of 1940, the campaign in Western Europe moved with remarkable speed. The Netherlands and Belgium were overrun, and France, considered one of Europe's strongest military powers, fell within weeks. These victories strengthened Hitler's confidence. Across Germany, state-controlled propaganda portrayed the campaigns as proof of German military superiority and of Hitler's leadership. At the same time, the regime tightened its control at home, suppressing dissent and expanding persecution of those it considered enemies. Yet one major opponent remained. Britain refused to negotiate peace. The German leadership hoped that sustained air attacks would weaken British resistance. The resulting air campaign, known as the Battle of Britain, became the first major military setback for Nazi Germany. Despite heavy bombing and enormous destruction, Britain did not surrender. For the first time since the war had begun, Germany's momentum had been checked. Even so, Hitler soon turned his attention eastward. He believed that defeating the Soviet Union would secure Germany's position in Europe. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest military invasions in history. Millions of soldiers crossed the border as the front stretched for thousands of kilometers. The opening months brought rapid advances, but the campaign soon encountered fierce resistance, immense distances, supply problems, and the harsh realities of war on the Eastern Front. As winter arrived, German forces found themselves unprepared for prolonged fighting under extreme conditions. The conflict reached a turning point at Stalingrad. Months of brutal combat devastated the city. Street by street, building by building, both sides fought under unimaginable conditions. When the German Sixth Army finally surrendered in early 1943, the defeat shocked Germany and encouraged Allied forces around the world. From that moment onward, the strategic balance increasingly shifted. In North Africa, Allied victories reduced Axis influence. In the skies above Europe, Allied bombing campaigns intensified. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy during the D-Day invasion, opening a major Western front. Germany now faced advancing armies from both east and west. As Allied forces moved closer to Berlin, the situation inside Germany deteriorated rapidly. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were heavily damaged, and millions of civilians struggled to survive the final months of the war. By April 1945, Soviet forces had entered Berlin. The fighting was fierce, and much of the city was destroyed. Deep beneath the streets, inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler remained with a small group of advisors and staff. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim. Many of the military formations he hoped would defend the capital no longer existed or could no longer reach Berlin. On April 29th, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony inside the bunker. Less than 24 hours later, on April 30th, both died by suicide. According to eyewitness accounts from those present, their bodies were carried outside the bunker entrance and burned in accordance with Hitler's instructions as Soviet forces closed in on the area. Only days later, Berlin surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Germany accepted unconditional surrender in Europe. The war that had begun, with promises of rapid victory, ended with devastated cities, millions of displaced people, and unprecedented human loss. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The Holocaust claimed the lives of approximately 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other victims targeted by the Nazi regime, including Roma, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, political opponents, and others persecuted on racial, political, or ideological grounds. Entire communities were destroyed, and countless families were left without homes or loved ones. When the fighting finally stopped, Europe had been transformed. Borders changed, governments fell. New international institutions emerged in an effort to reduce the risk of another global war. The conflict also reshaped science, technology, and global politics, setting the stage for the Cold War that followed. Adolf Hitler had once spoken of creating a 1,000-year empire. Instead, the regime he led collapsed after just 12 years in power. His story remains one of history's clearest reminders of how authoritarianism, propaganda, and the concentration of unchecked power can lead to catastrophe on an enormous scale. The Second World War did not begin because of one speech or one battle. It emerged from a combination of political instability, economic crisis, extremist ideology, and decisions made over many years. Understanding that history is not about glorifying the people who shaped it. It is about recognizing the warning signs, remembering the millions of victims, and understanding how fragile peace can be. As the ruins of Berlin slowly gave way to reconstruction, the world entered a new era, but the lessons of those years continue to matter, because history is never only about the past. Sometimes, it is the clearest warning for the future. Epilogue. As news of Hitler's death spread across Europe, the war in Europe was almost over. Within days, Berlin surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially accepted unconditional surrender, bringing the fighting in Europe to an end. But victory did not erase the devastation. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions of families searched for missing loved ones. Countless soldiers never returned home. Across Europe, survivors began the difficult task of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by 6 years of war. The world also began to uncover the full scale of Nazi crimes. Concentration and extermination camps revealed the systematic murder of millions of innocent people. These discoveries shocked the international community and reshaped how the world understood the consequences of dictatorship, hatred, and unchecked power. In the years that followed, many of the surviving Nazi leaders were brought before international tribunals to answer for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Their trials established legal principles that continue to influence international justice today. The Second World War changed the course of history forever. Nations were rebuilt, borders shifted, new alliances formed, and the world entered the tense decades of the Cold War. The newly created United Nations sought to reduce the chances of another global conflict, though peace would remain fragile. More than 80 years have now passed since those events, yet the lessons remain as relevant as ever. History reminds us that democracies can be weakened from within, that propaganda can shape entire societies, and that fear and division can be exploited by those seeking absolute power. The story of Adolf Hitler is not remembered because of his success. It is remembered because of the destruction that followed. More than 60 million people lost their lives during the Second World War. Entire generations were changed forever, and countless families carried the scars for decades. Understanding this history is not about glorifying those who caused the tragedy. It is about remembering those who suffered through it, learning from the mistakes of the past, and recognizing the warning signs before they appear again. Because history is not only a record of what happened, it is a reminder of what must never happen again.